11 men had turned Samuel Reed away in less than 3 weeks, and by the 12th morning, he had stopped telling them what he was actually good at. In Shoshone, a man could admit he was hungry, tired, or broke, but saying he had once managed provisions for a railroad camp made employers look at him differently, as though experience could somehow be more trouble than it was worth. So Samuel kept that part of his past folded inside his worn coat and simply asked for work. Any work. He had enough money for perhaps a few more meals, and after that he didn't know what he'd do. Dust rolled through the streets of Shoshone as trains came and went near the depot, carrying travelers, workers, and men who seemed to know exactly where they were headed. Samuel wasn't one of them. He carried a small valise, wore a weathered hat, and had the quiet expression of a man who had learned not to expect doors to open. 2 streets from the depot stood Bennett Eating House, a busy little restaurant owned by Louisa Bennett, a capable woman who had built the place with her own hands and trusted very few people with it. That afternoon, while Louisa checked a supplier's invoice at the counter, the front door opened and Samuel stepped inside. He removed his hat before speaking. "Ma'am, I was wondering if you needed another pair of hands." Louisa looked him over carefully. "What can you do?" "Whatever needs doing. Wood, water, dishes, cleaning, carrying." "And if I don't need anyone?" Samuel didn't lower his eyes. "Then I'll ask somewhere else. I just need something to eat and a place to sleep." There was no performance in his voice. He wasn't trying to make her feel sorry for him. He was simply stating the truth. Louisa studied him for another moment before giving him 3 days. If he worked, she would pay him. He would receive meals and could use the narrow room behind the kitchen during the trial. No charity, no promises, and no special treatment. Samuel agreed immediately. By sunset, he was hauling firewood and carrying water while Agnes Doyle, the kitchen's stern and experienced cook, watched him from the corner of her eye. Samuel worked without complaint. He didn't behave as though washing pots was beneath him, and he never entered Agnes's kitchen space without permission. By the 2nd day, he remembered where everything belonged and rarely needed the same instruction twice. Louisa noticed. What interested her more was that he seemed to notice things other workers ignored. When a shipment of flour, canned goods, and dried meat arrived, Samuel asked how many meals the restaurant usually served during the evening rush and whether the delivery was meant for ordinary business or an upcoming order. Louisa paused. A laborer carrying crates. Wasn't supposed to think about inventory. "Why do you ask?" she said. Samuel shrugged. "Seems useful to know what you're carrying before you stack it." She said nothing, but she remembered. Later, she asked him to check the supplier's list against the actual crates. Within minutes, he found that several items were missing. It was a simple counting mistake, but Louisa began watching him more closely. Samuel never bragged about his ability. He simply did the work. Then came the first mistake. Trying to improve the narrow rear passage, Samuel moved the washing station several feet to create what he thought was a cleaner route. For an hour. The arrangement seemed perfect. Then Minnie Lyle came through carrying a full tray and discovered her normal path blocked. She had to take the longer route during the busiest part of the day. Louisa found Samuel afterward and explained exactly why the passage mattered. Samuel could have defended himself, but he didn't. "I didn't understand how your house moved," he admitted. "What can't be moved?" Louisa answered him, and Samuel listened. He restored the passage and changed his plan around the restaurant's existing rhythm. The next evening, everything worked better. Louisa noticed something then. Samuel wasn't just capable. He could accept correction without letting pride get in the way. When his 3-day trial ended, she paid him and asked whether he'd found another job. "Not yet," he replied. Before she could decide what to say, a local traveler named Edwin Marsh entered with an offer that would test everyone in the restaurant. A group traveling toward Shoshone Falls needed supper for 24 people on one evening, in addition to Bennett Eating House's regular customers. Louisa knew it could bring valuable business, but it could also overwhelm her small staff. She accepted the challenge. Samuel immediately began asking questions about arrival times, seating, supplies, clean dishes, serving order, and how quickly tables would need to turn. Louisa finally looked at him and asked, "Where did you learn to think like that?" Samuel hesitated. For the first time, the secret inside his coat pocket seemed heavier than usual. "Railroad camps," he said quietly. "I used to. Keep the provisions and head counts." Louisa's expression changed. She suddenly understood that the quiet man asking for washing work had once been responsible for feeding entire crews. But Samuel still didn't tell her everything. He had learned the hard way that people sometimes preferred a hungry stranger to a capable man who knew too much. And Louisa, without realizing it yet, was beginning to wonder what else he had been hiding. The next morning, Louisa gave Samuel more responsibility, but she made the boundaries clear. Agnes remained in complete control of the kitchen. Louisa controlled customers, money, suppliers, and final decisions. Samuel would handle receiving, counts, table timing, helpers, and the movement of supplies. His pay would increase because the responsibility had increased. He agreed without bargaining. For the first time in months, Samuel felt something unfamiliar. Not pity, not temporary acceptance, but genuine trust beginning to take shape. Still, he knew trust had to be earned every day. He watched Agnes carefully before suggesting anything about the kitchen. He followed Minnie's route through the dining room before changing how plates were carried. He studied the suppliers and learned which deliveries arrived early and which were often late. He had once believed that knowing how to manage a camp meant knowing how to manage anything. His mistake with the rear passage had taught him otherwise. Every place had its own rhythm, and a good man learned that rhythm before trying to change it. Louisa noticed how quickly he adapted. She also noticed how often she found herself standing beside him at the counter after closing, talking longer than necessary. Their conversations started with business, but slowly wandered into ordinary things. He told her about cold mornings on railroad camps and men who could eat twice their share after a hard day's work. She told him about growing up in a smaller town and building Bennett Eating House after refusing to let the business fail. Neither called those conversations important, but both remembered them. The traveler. Supper drew closer. Then Edwin returned with unexpected news. The party had grown. 24 guests had become 30. Louisa stared at him for a long moment. 30 travelers, plus the restaurant's regular customers, meant the busiest evening she had ever attempted. Agnes immediately gave the kitchen's honest limit. Samuel calculated the additional dishes, serving time, seating, requirements, and supplies. Louisa made the final decision. "We'll take them." Samuel didn't smile. He simply began preparing. He checked every count twice. He separated supplies for the traveler party from the restaurant's ordinary stock. He organized helpers without ordering people around. He even asked Agnes what part of the kitchen absolutely could not be interrupted. "Now you're learning," she told him. The words were almost approval. On the afternoon of the supper, everything appeared ready. Then the first wave of travelers arrived early. The dining room filled faster than expected. Plates began moving, chairs scraped, orders overlapped. Regular customers continued arriving, and the narrow rear passage became crowded with dirty dishes, clean, plates, servants, and supplies. Samuel watched without panic. He knew the difference between a busy room and a room beginning to lose control. Then the real trouble hit. The extra guests all arrived within minutes of one another. Dirty dishes returned faster than the staff could clear them. A helper carrying a tray became trapped between two tables. Too regular. Customers waited longer than promised, and one of them complained that the large party had taken over the entire restaurant. Louisa had only moments to respond. Samuel stepped beside her. He didn't take command, away from her. Instead, he gave her the information she needed. If we hold the next seating for 3 minutes, the clean plates catch up. Move one helper from carrying to clearing. The delay stays under 7 minutes. Louisa trusted his judgment. She gave the instructions. The backlog stopped growing. Then it began to shrink. Agnes kept the kitchen moving with steady determination. Minnie adjusted her route without being asked. Samuel moved through the room like someone who had spent years watching numbers become people. He wasn't simply counting plates anymore. He was reading the entire room. At one point, Louisa saw him with his sleeves rolled up, collar open, one cuff damp from the kitchen, moving between tables while calmly correcting problems before they became disasters. For a brief second, she forgot about the customers and simply watched him. There was something about the man she had first seen standing at her door, asking only for food and a bed that no longer matched the man standing in front of her. Samuel caught her looking, and Louisa quickly turned away. The evening ended without disaster. The travelers were fed, the regular customers were served, and Bennett Eating House had survived its largest supper yet. Edwin was impressed. Owen Morrow, a local freight operator, had also been watching Samuel's work. When the final accounts were checked, Owen quietly told Samuel he wanted to discuss paid work with him. "A man who can keep numbers straight under pressure is useful," Owen said. Samuel thanked him but made no promises. Later, Ruth Whitcomb asked Louisa whether Samuel was married. It was an innocent question, but Louisa felt strangely uncomfortable hearing it. She realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. The thought of Samuel leaving Shoshone suddenly bothered her. Not because Bennett Eating House needed him. It didn't. The restaurant had survived before him and would survive afterward. What frightened her was the possibility that she had begun to need his presence for reasons that had nothing to do with business. When the room finally emptied, Samuel remained at the counter finishing the final count. Louisa watched him longer than she should have. Tomorrow, his trial would officially end. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to know what came after. The morning after the great supper, Louisa placed Samuel's earned wages on the counter and counted every coin carefully. She had promised him fair pay, and she intended to keep that promise. Samuel accepted the money without asking for more. Their agreement had always been clear, and neither of them tried to turn the ending into something it wasn't. Louisa thanked him for the work. Samuel thanked her for giving him the chance. Yet neither moved away immediately. There was too much left unsaid between them. Samuel had received Owen Morrow's offer for steady work handling freight records and supplies. It was exactly the kind of responsibility he had once been afraid to admit he knew how to do. He asked Owen about wages, duties, working hours, and who had final authority. Owen respected him for asking. "You don't take a man's word for the important things, do you?" Owen said. Samuel gave a faint smile. "I've learned not to." The job was real, the pay was fair, and Samuel accepted. He also found a small room of his own in town. When he returned to Bennett Eating House to tell Louisa, she smiled and congratulated him. She meant it. She was genuinely happy that the man who had arrived with almost nothing had finally found a place where his skills were wanted. But beneath that happiness was a quiet ache she couldn't explain away. Samuel no longer needed the little room behind her kitchen. He no longer needed her restaurant. He had his own work, his own room, and a future that no longer depended on whether Louisa gave him another day. That should have made everything simple. Instead, it made her realize how much she had come to care about him. The days passed. Samuel settled into Owen's freight business, and Bennett Eating House grew busier after. Edwin's traveler party recommended it to others. Louisa had gotten the opportunity she wanted. Her restaurant was becoming known as a reliable stop for larger groups. Samuel had gotten something he needed even more. Dignity through work, he understood. Their lives could now continue separately. That was what should have happened. One evening, after closing, Louisa stepped outside and saw Samuel walking past the mercantile. She almost let him go. Then she called his name. He stopped and turned. For a moment, neither spoke. "Would you walk with me?" Louisa asked. Samuel looked at the fading summer light, then at her. "I'd like that." He removed his hat, just as he had done on the afternoon he first walked into her restaurant. Louisa noticed the gesture but said nothing. They walked slowly through the dusty street, talking about ordinary things. He asked where she had grown up. She told him about the smaller town she had left behind. She asked whether he had ever imagined settling somewhere permanently. Samuel was quiet for a while. "I stopped making plans that far ahead," he admitted. "For a long time, I was just trying to get through the next week." Louisa looked at him. "And now?" He glanced toward the restaurant behind them. "Now I'm starting to think about what might come after the next week." They continued walking. Samuel told her that he had spent years moving from one camp to another, always carrying a valise and never knowing how long he would stay. Louisa admitted she had spent years believing that keeping a business alive meant keeping everything else at a safe distance. Neither of them laughed at the confession. They understood each other more than they expected. At the end of the street, Samuel stopped. "Louisa, when I first came through your door, I wasn't looking for anything except food and a place to sleep." She smiled faintly. "I remember. I didn't expect to find work that mattered, or people who noticed whether I stayed." Louisa looked down before meeting his eyes again. "I noticed." The words were simple, but they carried everything she had been unable to say. Samuel stepped a little closer. "Would you mind if I came by tomorrow after work?" Louisa smiled. "You'd better. I still have a restaurant to run." He laughed softly. She laughed too. Nothing about their future was promised yet, but something had changed. Samuel no longer stood outside a door asking whether there was room for him. He had earned his place in the town, in his work, and perhaps, if Louisa allowed it, in her life. And Louisa had discovered that sometimes the person who arrives asking for the smallest thing can leave you wondering how you ever imagined the room without him. Their story didn't begin with wealth, power, or a grand rescue. It began with a tired man removing his hat and asking for honest work. But in the quiet years that followed, people in Shoshone would remember the night Bennett Eating House handled 30 hungry travelers without losing its regular customers. They would remember the man who kept the numbers straight. Louisa would remember something else. She would remember that before Samuel Reed became the man everyone wanted to hire, he had simply been the stranger who stood at her door and said, "I just need food and somewhere to sleep." And somehow, that stranger had become the man she wanted walking beside her when the sun went down.